So good, so good, so good.
Spring styles are at Nordstrom Rack stores now, and they're up to 60% off. Stock up and save on Rag & Bone, Madewell, Vince, All Saints, and more of your favorites.
How did I not know Rack has Adidas?
Why do we rack? For the hottest deals. Just so many good brands.
Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by University of Northern Iowa political scientist Justin Holmes and a special guest, Kirby Goodell. Kirby is a professor of political science at Texas A&M, host of the most excellent Inside Political Science podcast, which you can find in all major podcast apps and will be linked in today's show notes. Kirby's also a grad school friend of mine. And, when we were in the program at the University of Kentucky, he was one of those guys we all kind of looked up to, knew he was going places. I was the guy who spent way too much time watching Beverly Hills 90210 and Matlock reruns and then kind of panicking when I didn't understand my econometrics lesson. So, but anyway, very different past, but I'm really glad to have you here today. Kirby and Justin, you ready to get going?
Yeah, good morning,
All
Mike.
fired up and ready to go.
All right. Well, before we do that, one thing I wanted to let folks know about another podcast I think you might like. Red and blue states, sometimes they seem so far apart, they might as well be different countries, like post-World War II East and West Germany. And if you feel that way too, check out the Signal Award-winning podcast, The Future of Our Former Democracy, from our friends at More Equitable Democracy. Back for a brand new season, the show examines what the U.S. can learn from Germany's political history, including how the aftermath of Nazi Germany shaped a more resilient democratic system and what that might mean for America's current challenges. Co-hosted by Heather Villanueva and Colin Cole, the podcast blends sound-rich history and contemporary analysis to explore how lessons from Nazi Germany shaped a resilient political system and what America's current democratic challenges expose. You can follow The Future of Our Former Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now. Okay, so this week, the Supreme Court essentially did away with the remainder of the Voting Rights Act. The 6-3 decision, it was along partisan lines, struck down a Louisiana map with 2 majority black congressional districts. Now, the court did not declare Section 2 of the VRA unconstitutional entirely, as some thought, but it rewrote the test for violations of it in a way that will make it nearly impossible to successfully advance a VRA-based claim. Now, going forward, plaintiffs alleging racial vote dilution must prove 3 new things. First, that their alternative map preserves every partisan goal the state names, including incumbent protection, important here in this Louisiana case. Second, that racial block voting cannot be explained by partisanship. And third, that there is present-day intentional discrimination with historical discrimination given little weight by comparison. Now, in states where black voters vote Democratic and white voters vote Republican, that is, a lot of the Deep South, those tests are nearly impossible to meet. A state can now defend almost any map by saying, well, we did it for partisan advantage. And in their Russo versus Common Cause decision, the Supreme Court ruled that federal courts can't consider partisan gerrymanders. Now, under Calais, that defense now also defeats racial claims for all intents and purposes. Justice Kagan, writing in dissent here, called this the completed demolition of the act. She read her dissent from the bench and dropped the word respectfully from the traditional I respectfully dissent conclusion to indicate the severity of her opposition to the majority's decision. The decision is likely to have a minimal impact on redistricting before the 2026 midterms. That's just because of time constraints, but it'll almost always certainly be a factor in 2028. And various estimates, they vary a lot, but suggest that this could lead to a net gain of Republicans of maybe a dozen or more seats over time. Also this week, Florida's Republican legislature approved a new congressional map that the GOP believes could net them 4 additional seats. Florida's state constitution bans partisan gerrymandering due to a 2010 initiative approved by voters, but Governor DeSantis and state Republicans argue that the anti-gerrymandering provision is itself unconstitutional because it forces race-based line drawing that violates the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. There's a lot there. Justin, let's start with you. Do you think the majority got this one right or not?
Oh, if you'd like me to elaborate, I suppose I can.
All right, well, let's move on then to our next story.
No, finished. I think this is really highly problematic. There has been a push by the courts for a long time to walk a lot of this back. And, the kind of line that they have had is that, there might have been a time where racial discrimination was serious enough and acute enough that this was something that we need to do to preserve some form of fairness. But gosh, those days are just over, and that's that ship has sailed. But just given kind of Louisiana bringing the suit, and frankly, it appears are planning to suspend the primary to redistrict as of yesterday, even though some absentee ballots have been cast. To my mind, this really feels like an attempt to kind of do away with this. I'm hesitant to say that, we are this post-racial society still when it comes to redistricting or, darn near anything else. And so, but I think one of the bigger issues here, to my mind, is that, one of the sort of innovations of civil rights legislation of that period was this shift from sort of having to prove intent to simply being able to prove facts. And I think if you are looking for intent, that's going to be really hard, even if there's intent there. People are smart enough, mostly, I wouldn't say always, but smart enough not to kind of leave smoking gun evidence that, we're disenfranchising Black people and that's why we're doing this. And then giving that partisan scapegoat there, I think it makes it basically very easy to disenfranchise Black voters or Latino voters and really have no recourse, because proving that sort of claim is just darn near impossible here.
Yeah, but before I ask Kirby your thoughts on this, I'll just say before I forget, because that'll happen sometimes. I guess I object to the term disenfranchise, and I'll say that, I think there's a difference between disenfranchising someone and not allowing them to be in the district where they are the majority and can pick their, maybe that's a technical thing, I don't know, but to me, that's a distinction.
To be fair, you're correct.
That matters.
And per our previous conversation, 8 o'clock on a Saturday is awfully early for me. So, I will stipulate that, yeah.
Yeah,
Nobody is being disenfranchised yet. By this. On the other hand, there is the possibility here that beyond the districting, this would be all of the Voting Rights Act. And so that covers a lot more than districting. So you could imagine a scenario, at least down the road, where there are other impacts. But no, I was just being sloppy because it's 8:15 on a Saturday morning.
There you go. It's understandable. Kirby, what are your thoughts on this decision?
Let me see how many people I can offend with this. All right. First, the idea
Fabulous.
of the Supreme Court and the illusion that they've tried to create it, especially on the conservative side, that they are originalist or and somehow not activists. This is a very conservative activist court. It's the flip of the Warren court. It's just pushing things in a conservative direction. It seems unquestionable to me that this is a court that has a very strong set of partisan preferences that they are trying to implement in terms of their decision making. But on this case in particular, one of the things if you go back into the 90s, Republicans really loved the Voting Rights Act. And they really loved the Voting Rights Act because what you could do is you could take all those minority voters and pack them into a 65% minority district, and then they weren't in any of the other districts, especially in places like the South. I'll throw out a hypothesis. I don't have great data to support it. I think this is uncontested, just in terms of the math of it, is that what do you pack those voters into a single district? The districts around them become more conservative, whiter, more Republican. And so Republicans are like, this is great for us. This is a gerrymander in and of itself, created in a way that helps our political party in these states. What that has meant, I think, in terms of our politics of polarization, is that in these places, and that you have more liberal minority members who are getting elected, and all around more conservative Republican members who are getting elected. If you sort of break it out that way, you say, well, this could actually be net positive for the Democrats going forward. There's a trick here, right? You want the more you make more districts competitive, the more you make them competitive. and so what does it mean to have a district that goes from 65% minority to having a lot of districts that go from, say, 10% minority to 20 or 30% minority? Now you have a formula for the Democratic Party, anyway, to at least compete if they're thinking about how to win those voters. But to do so, they have to be way more moderate and way less progressive. On the Republican side, if you're going to represent those voters and represent them effectively, you also have to be way more moderate. And so I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics here in terms of where this moves and where this goes that we haven't even fully wrapped our heads around. In the short term, it looks like, oh, you get rid of the minority districts and maybe you get another Republican district. But in the long term, when you have a chance for the parties to react and respond and start thinking about the candidates they want to put forward, I think it gets a lot trickier. Unquestionably, it hurts descriptive representation in our Congress for minority groups. More questionable, what does it do about substantive representation and the ideas that are being represented, and whether the group's interests are being advanced more favorably because of and there I don't have a strong sense of that, but I'm not sure it clearly works against minority interest in the long run in terms of policy. In terms of members being elected, you're going to be running a different type of member and trying to win in a different type of way with a different set of policy preferences.
Yeah, I surprised myself. Sometimes I do this. I actually found myself agreeing mostly with the majority, and to a certain extent, I even thought there was something to Justice Thomas's concurrence. And it's not going to be a popular position here, but I think a conservative concern that's at least worth taking seriously, even if you end up not agreeing with it, is that in some instances, especially in the Deep South, less so in some other districts, areas which have traditionally been covered by the VRA, the old pre-clearance areas and so forth, which some were even up as far as New York State, that race and party in some of these areas have become so highly correlated that Section 2 enforcement starts to look less like court-ordered racial, it has to be less racial, and so it looks more like court-ordered democratic gerrymandering, essentially. And I think that's a serious concern because, Justin, you mentioned the difference going from the effects test to the intent test. And I agree, the intent test is almost impossible to demonstrate as long as no one's being moronic. But we've seen state legislators can be incredibly moronic at times. And sometimes we do get that evidence. But if they are going to be smart, the problem with moving to an effects test is that's also problematic when you have, 90+% of voters by race going for one party or another. And so there's a real tension here. And I don't think, as some in the media have pointed out, that is argued, it's just, this Supreme Court hates voting rights and black people and so forth. This actually is a tough case because Justice Alito's right is, I think, when he said that, tend to be very much against any sort of racial considerations unless it can pass that sort of strict scrutiny. And it's reasonable to say, hey, have things changed enough since 1965, that pervasive history pattern of discrimination? Does that still pass strict scrutiny? And the majority decided no. And I think they make a pretty strong case for that. Any thoughts on that, Justin?
I think this does, kind of your comments and Kirby's comments, do get to something even a little deeper, in a way, which is that it's never been entirely clear sort of what is the good outcome here, so if we are, what is a fair outcome along racial lines. And there was, I'm drawing a blank on who wrote it, but there was an APSR, AJPS article that very much did demonstrate that, by pulling black voters into kind of majority districts, you were having that effect on white, the white districts. On the other hand, I do wonder, to the extent that we're polarized today, I'm not sure that if you bump up the diversity of a district, I don't know that that goes back or has the same impact that it might have had, 30 years ago. If you're just throwing kind of black voters into a district where they always lose. But I think there are a lot of things tied up here. I mean, there is the partisanship component of this, where we have, and frankly, if we're putting all this together, I'm not a big fan of partisan gerrymandering, even though it's a long American tradition, and the court doesn't really care about that. So, it seems like we're throwing all of these things together. I think part of this gets to kind of a deeper problem with representative democracy, in that, we are a very geographic-based system, in terms of votes. This is something I've been harping on. It's been that week in my Inter-American class, but that is not necessarily a proxy for all of the kinds of conflicts that we have, and maybe it was at one time and maybe not. But I think all of this gerrymandering stuff, whether it be by race or whether it be by party, kind of gets at this problem of, what does it mean to be represented? How do we translate preferences into votes, et cetera. And I feel like a lot of this is, because we're overlaying geography onto this, there's a lot of weird monkeying around, to use technical political science jargon, in terms of serving some of these other interests, none of which has a clear, correct, and fair answer. So I'm often a little bit flummoxed by, sort of all of these, I don't like gerrymandering, kind of in general. I thought there might be a solid racial reason to do it, and still potentially do, but it's really unclear. We're trying to reach sort of some other goals through ways that are really messy, when we do that. And it's just sort of it's a feature that's, unless you're to switch to some sort of proportional representation or something, I mean, it's just a feature that we're sort of stuck with, in a system where everything is based on where you live, but then we can decide what the district is, to serve other goals.
I guess, on one hand, I feel like a lot of these cases, after the Rucho decision, which I disagreed with. That's the one that says that the partisan gerrymanders are political questions, can't be considered by the courts. I disagree with the court's conclusion there. But I think that since that decision, a lot of things that would have been presented as partisan gerrymanders are presented as racial gerrymanders. And that, I guess, I have a real problem with that, with the gerrymandering in general. I think this idea that partisan gerrymanders can't be considered, that to me was just a colossally bad decision, but there it is. And so I just think that kind of paved the way. I mean, we see a series of decisions, right, kind of paving the way to this outcome that we've had. But I don't know. I just, in the end, I was torn, because in terms of policy, I tend to agree with a lot of what you guys are saying. But in terms of looking at the Constitution and the test, I don't know. I think the majority has a slightly better argument here. I would have felt differently if it were even 20 years ago. Even 20 years ago, that's how an old person talks. But anyways, so Kirby, thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the questions is what role should the courts have in this? And the voting rights was reauthorized. When was it reauthorized? And so there is that question, which is also part of this. But going back to Justin's point, one of the real challenges here, if we are going to have this district-based system, which we should scratch. If I could do one reform of American politics, it would, let's get rid of these districts. There is no fair way to draw the districts we have, and there's no way to remove political interest from drawing the districts. Even if you do nonpartisan redistricting plans, somebody's drawing the lines and they favor some interest over other interest. And the reality is we've gotten so good. We got such great data. We have such great maps. We can get down to the household level and say, what happens to this district if you put this household in this district versus that. Now, there's a lot of prediction that goes into that. And in Texas, for example, there is some thought now that the Republican gerrymander here may backfire because a lot of the Hispanic voters that had moved into the Republican camp look like they may be moving out of the Republican camp. So you've got to predict what people are going to do in the future, which, we're not very good at it in all cases, but we do have lots of good information in terms of drawing these districts. And what we're letting go on is the politicians are picking the voters instead of the voters picking the politicians. And we have people winning at 100%, nearly 100% rates. And no one likes the Congress. Congressional approval is in the tank. And that's a broken system. And part of the reason it's broken is because you can win without solving any problems. And as we'll talk about in other areas today, the Congress is pretty worthless in standing up to the president.
I certainly agree with you about doing away with districts. And of course, there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits that. And even in the early days of the Republic, there were some areas where there were multi-member districts, and that would take care of that. Also, another thing that I would be very much for would be expanding the size of the House, which was a routine thing for quite a while. And now we're at I think it was stopped almost about a century ago, maybe a little bit more. And now we're at the point where we started out with, 20, 30,000 in a district and now close to 800,000. And that just raises real questions of how do you actually represent that many people in a what's supposed to be the people's house. And I think that's part of a larger problem that I think would solve a lot of problems, including the gerrymandering problem. But of course, neither of those things are at all on the table because, as always, the incumbents are interested primarily in incumbent protection, and they designed the laws about redistricting and voting to ensure incumbent protection. And it's kind of a catch-22, I think.
Just as an aside, Illinois actually had, for a brief period in the 60s and 70s, had multi-member state legislative districts. And then when they ended it, they had one election where the state legislature was elected statewide at large, which was just a complete fiasco, apparently, as one might expect. But, it does open up the possibility. I mean, we are very locked into this, geographic single member district thing that you're absolutely right. I mean, there's nothing that mandates really that's how you have to do things, but we don't have big imaginations and frankly there are vested interests, I think, in keeping things the way they have been.
Well, why don't we move on to our second story for today? And Justin, I will let you take that one.
Yeah, so Saturday night we have a third alleged assassination attempt on President Trump. Unlike the first one in Pennsylvania, in this case, the shooter doesn't get particularly close. And there is a lot of political fallout here, a lot of discussion, etc. Although I say that a week on, it's already, just as the fire hose of politics happens, it's already less in our consciousness. But certainly this brings up sort of a lot of things. Sort of levels of security. Does security work here? Things like, is political rhetoric too divisive at this point? Is that sort of radicalizing people, etc.? For what it's worth, Cole Allen, the shooter here, does not seem, particularly to have a strange media diet from what we've picked out. Seems to be a fairly, at least from what we've seen, fairly non-radical looking, person, and yet shows up with guns at an event. Of course, then where does this feed in with building the ballroom? That night, President Trump makes in sort of former his remarks afterwards that, gosh, this is an argument for building that more secure ballroom. And I'll be darned if every conservative pundit in the minutes after isn't posting the same thing on Truth Social and X and everywhere else. So, political violence, just as with my standard disclaimer, don't shoot people. That's not nice and not good and not how we do things. But, this certainly brings up a lot of things. Mike, what are your sort of initial reactions to this and thoughts and what the fallout might be?
I guess my initial reaction is if you want a lot of media coverage, do an assassination attempt at a at a correspondence dinner. That's a winner right there. So that was smart. I mean, the guy was Caltech. He knew what he was doing, I guess. But more seriously, the system worked, I think, as well as it reasonably well, right? The gunman barely got past the security checkpoint, wasn't close to the ballroom where Trump and the other top officials were. So I know it's not common that one of the Secret Service agents was in fact shot, but it seems to me that the system worked about as well as it could be expected to, and it did the important thing. It protected those officials from getting hurt. Now that said, about the whole ballroom argument, I think that is, kind of ridiculous, but the old saying on both sides that never let a good crisis go to waste, and this is a good argument
you beat me
for
to it.
that sort of thing. And of course, a White House ballroom would be even more secure, but it's not like that hotel was this kind of unsecure spot. They've been using the Washington Hilton for events for a long time. It's been designed or redesigned with various security things. And like I said, it kind of worked. And I would be for a White House ballroom if Congress approves it, not just by presidential fiat, I suppose. Kirby, what do you think?
Well, a lot of places to go with this particular conversation, but one of them is, I think that you hear all the conspiracy theories coming out about ballrooms and whether this is a real assassination attempt or not. I think that's kind of silly. I think the real question is, how is our political system set up so that as soon as an event like this happens, to your all's point, immediately everyone falls in line with talking points, and it's all about making use of this to get something that the political party already wants or is already in the process of going after, and so you see this falling in line right after the assassination attempt. And so that to me is one of the more, how do you move outside of that where we can deal with these things in a serious way and get to the heart of the matter rather than trying to use it politically? Now, to the ballroom, I think one of the things that people have pointed out, this would not have been held in a White House ballroom anyway. This is not a White House event. This is not a Trump event. This is an event he happened to attend. There are some questions that you have about the level of security. I agree, Mike, generally with your point that it worked, but you're like, wow, he got all the way over. He was able to check into the hotel. But he was making use of the fact that we live in a free society. And as long as we live in a free society, there's going to be the possibility of showing up at places with of people showing up and doing bad things, because that's the cost of a free society.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned the conspiracy, angle of this, because certainly I've seen a lot of that. And in context, what's also interesting is that there had been kind of an uptick in a couple articles written the week before about conspiracies around the Pennsylvania shooting, I kind of, have, I was making air quotes, I think, around assassination attempt here. Again, don't shoot at the Secret Service, et cetera. But, this and the golf course thing in Florida, in both cases, clearly there's intent there, but nobody gets close. It's really not close to that. But the one where he does get shot in the ear, suddenly there has always been a bit on the left, a bit of a conspiracy, there, and gosh, it healed awfully fast, and, there's no chunk out of it, and, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like we're getting into, Johnny Cochran kind of territory here on some level. But what was interesting is that there have been sort of more people on the right endorsing that as well, that shooting was a conspiracy, which I'm not exactly sure where that's coming from, but there had been several surveys that had shown, some sort of former Trump supporters, that thought, well, gosh, that was staged too, and the idea is that, this is about getting sympathy, getting other goals, et cetera. And gosh, it just seems too convenient, that these things keep happening when the president's unpopular and wants a ballroom that nobody wants to build him and things like that. I'm not endorsing any of these, but I think it was striking to me that this sort of drops at a period where even the thing that's probably the least likely to be a false flag, operation, is getting questioned by people. And it does we are really primed, I think, at this point to be conspiratorial. I think there is so little so little trust at this point. And, this has, I think, always been the concern is that, in a free society, as Kirby rightly points out, we've got freedom of movement. You can take guns places, not so much in DC, but, it's, having a gun out in public is not necessarily a crime, either. And, particularly at being at this hotel, they don't search your bags on the way in, and, you're at a hotel that's doing a lot of other things and so on. So, I think there is this, this level of possibility that you get these lone wolves, in a society where we're going to have this. And I think that's something a little different. If we look at kind of past attempts, you have more coordination, past political assassinations, you have more coordination, you have people that are part of groups, et cetera. I mean, even if it is a group that's the Manson family, in the Gerald Ford attempt in one case. But here, these are people, it looks like across the board that really are lone wolf style types, and I think that's something that has shifted a bit. The shooter, the attempted shooter, in this case, doesn't seem to be affiliated with anybody, nor did the kid who took the shots in Pennsylvania, or frankly, the guy who murdered political figures in Minnesota, or the Charlie Kirk killer. And I think that's something different and in some ways almost a little scarier because it's maybe a little harder to defend against. I mean, we have enough tech that at this point you can sort of surveil people engaged in conspiracies and things like that. But you just have some angry guy on the internet, and there's lots of angry guys on the internet. Yeah. And so I think that does, the concern here is that we've had sort of a qualitative shift that does make this maybe a little harder to police, going forward.
And there's certainly been a lot of talk about, are we at a new kind of peak of political violence? And to me, it just reinforces the point that people tend to have poor, if any, historical memories, because you take a look between 1970 and 1971, in like an 18-month period, there were around 2,500 political bombings in the U.S. Now, largely, Justin, as you point out, those were by groups, Weather Underground, Symbionese Liberation Army, that sort of thing, but also by some right-wing, I can say this, white supremacist groups, particularly in the South. The Klan was still much more active then and that sort of thing. And still, if you even look more recently, right-wing political violence is still much more common than left-wing, even though left-wing political violence has gone up in the Trump era. So, I mean, historically, this is not good. It's never good when you have three assassination attempts we know about against President Trump, but it pales in comparison to the absolute horror show that we had in the late 60s, early 70s, and of course all of those assassinations in the late 60s as well. So that's not to say this is not serious, just to say that we have seen far worse in our not all that distant past.
I mean, how many times did people take pot shots at poor Gerald Ford? But for the fact that they couldn't shoot straight, he might not have made it either.
He might have stumbled a few times there too to dodge the bullet.
Yeah, that's a big, broad point too. I think that the tendency to want to make everything today worse than it was in the past. I think that's a remarkable feature of our contemporary world. We grew up in the 70s. The 70s were a mess.
As I often tell my students, there were no good old days.
Yeah, and the idea that, democracy is uniquely threatened, well, maybe it is uniquely threatened, but the idea that it wasn't threatened in the 70s, that there weren't threats. We live in a system that is always at threat because it's only as good as the quality of the input that's coming in, and we're never necessarily safe from the American experiment faltering or failing. So that's part of it. But the violence part of it, I think, is your point is really good there. And I showed this to my class. I'm like, look, political violence, this is only an increase if you look over the most recent period and you take no broader historical look. And the main really interesting uptick is in left-wing political violence. So in some ways, yeah, maybe that's a that's a sign of polarization or of a bipartisan movement, but it's not exactly what most people portray it as when we talk about it. It's not an increase in violence. There is some increase, but it's short term, and it's not exactly we try to make it out to be to score political points.
And, moving from the violence thing to the ballroom issue again, I find the Trump administration's legal, and I'll almost put that in air quotes, arguments for his right to build this. I mean, one of the arguments is, right, well, we're doing this through private donations, not taxpayer funds, so that cuts Congress out of the loop. But then I wonder, well, do they have anyone who reads through the U.S. code before they actually look at this? Because there's a smack dab in there. It says you cannot build a structure on any federal government reservation park grounds without express authority of Congress. That's about as clear as it gets. Even if that weren't there, the idea of just allowing private donations to the president to build whatever stuff he wants to build, if that's not a fantastic avenue for massive corruption, I mean, the next thing you know, God only knows what's going to happen. What? Middle Eastern countries will be giving us jets or something like, no, that would never probably happen. I mean, it's just, that's insane. And the national security thing, the judge practically laughed that out of court. And apparently the Trump administration's attorney said, well, you know what? We can explain the national security stuff to you, but we can't share that information with the plaintiffs that are suing us. Sorry about that. You'll have to figure it out, I guess. And I mean, legally, this seems to be such a slam dunk sort of thing. And the idea that I get it. Trump doesn't like to try to work with Congress, especially this Congress where Republicans have such thin majorities. And he's certainly not a deal maker. He's a my way or the highway kind of deal maker. And as we're seeing with Iran, more on that in a little bit. But to me, this is very clearly the case. He didn't even, I think you can argue, have the authority to destroy the old East Wing, but he was able to do that before anyone could bring suit in time because it's a lot easier to do that than anyway. So I think it's just a ridiculous legal case.
I was going to jump on that last point that, he brings bulldozers in the middle of the night. I mean, setting aside the question of building things, bulldozing a third of the White House at 3 a.m. is probably a problem.
Well, and to tie into the earlier point, the idea that once upon a time, maybe we might have expected, and I don't want to be that guy who's like the old days were the better days, because I don't believe that to be true, but we might have once expected for members of Congress to stand up and say, wait, that is a constitutional prerogative, but we are in such a polarized party era that you just don't expect that to happen at all. And so the idea that Congress will push back and say we have the right to Democrats in Congress will, and maybe a couple of Republicans will join them, but not in sufficient enough numbers to say this is not what the president should be doing. This is not up to the. And so he's bold and he gets away with it because there's no one really other than the courts possibly to check him.
It's weird how we just kind of morphed into almost like a parliamentary system in that sense, at least the bad parts without the good parts. So, it's kind of...
We can at least get proportional representation out of that deal.
There you go. Exactly. Oh, Justin, sorry. I might have cut you off there.
I actually lost the thought, so it's fine.
Yeah, I remember I used to say to classes when I lost my train of thought, I just kept on talking until it came back to me eventually. Right?
Well, you're on to my tricks, yeah. But
yeah, exactly. It's a little teacher trick. Any other thoughts on the assassination attempt, the ballroom, political violence, anything like that? I guess not. All right, well, before we move on, did you ever wonder what sort of president you would be? Would you be the populist hero, the backroom dealer, or maybe a pragmatist who actually gets things done? Well, you can find out for yourself by stepping into the Oval Office with Fantasy President. It's a deep dive political simulator where the weight of the free world is on your shoulders. You can balance over 30 stakeholder groups from Wall Street to the AFL-CIO and navigate a high-stakes diplomacy system with 6 world powers. They've already got over 10,000 players building their own administration, testing policies and fighting for their legacy. And the best part, it's an open alpha and completely free to start. Check it out at fantasypresidentcareer.com, and you'll also find that link in the show notes. Okay, so the U.S. war against Iran is now past the 60-day mark. Well, depending on how you count that. We'll get to that in a minute. But the good news is that much of Iran's military has been destroyed, but the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Negotiations have been fruitless given how far apart U.S. and Iranian positions are, and the war powers deadline has arrived, again, depending on who you ask, without congressional authorization. Now, as I said, the administration disputes that. They argue that the April ceasefire terminated hostilities, so that 60-day war powers clock doesn't require a vote in Congress yet. Democrats argue the statute doesn't allow the president to pause the clock while U.S. forces keep enforcing a blockade and preparing possible new strikes. Now, at the same time, Iran has reportedly offered to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and extend or end the ceasefire, but only if nuclear talks are pushed back. Now, Trump rejected this. He wants the blockade to stay in place until Iran addresses its nuclear program. And this dispute is not just about whether this is smart foreign policy. It's about who gets to define the mission. If the White House can call the war over, call the blockade something other than hostilities, and use sanctions to keep pressure on Iran, well, Congress stays mostly reactive. And if Congress insists this is still a war, then the president needs authorization or has to wind down U.S. involvement, at least in theory. Now, the Strait's the obvious pressure point here. Energy flows sharply reduced. Treasury is sanctioning Iranian oil networks and warning shippers not to pay Iran for passage. The UAE is leaving OPEC, in part kind of related to this, kind of positioning itself for more flexibility, I think, if Gulf exports eventually normalize. But right now, I think the institutional question is, does Congress still control war authorization, or does the executive just get to relabel the conflict and keep moving along? So, Kirby, let's start with you. I mean, do you agree on that question? Does the ceasefire pause the clock for war powers, and should Congress be saying anything about this?
Well, lots of questions buried into that. The first is, Congress clearly has the war powers, and ideally we would have Congress vote before we put military force, put boots on the ground, or shot missiles, whatever the case may be, in any sort of sustained capacity. The reality is that hasn't been the case for, I don't know, how far back do we go? Presidents have effectively taken the war powers, and Congress has effectively given them the war powers. Even the War Powers Act itself is an admission that Congress couldn't live up to its responsibility by saying, well, we'll give you 60 days to do that thing. and then we'll come back and decide whether it's popular or not, and whether we want to weigh in on it, rather than saying up front whether we want to support the use of force in a military conflict. So, I don't think I would like the war powers to be in effect. I would like for Congress to have a say. I would like for Congress to live up to its constitutional responsibility to approve or disapprove of military force. I don't think we're going to see it. I think the president can just say no, and I don't think Congress will do anything about it unless, and there is a contingency here, and so the contingency is big, unless, and this may be the case with Iran, the war is just so unpopular that members feel emboldened to stand up to the president, and we may get to that place with this particular conflict. I'm not sure we're there yet, but we may be moving in that direction.
Justin?
Yeah, I think the popularity is kind of interesting, and I feel like we're tying a lot of things, together here in a way. And I also remembered it, and it's still germane, what I forgot to talk about earlier. So to pull a couple threads together, I think the popularity, could be an issue here. I have not seen a conflict in my lifetime, or at least in my time studying political science, that got this unpopular this fast. This is kind of latter-day Vietnam unpopular, somewhere around 60 days in, but who's counting? And so, there could well be some pressure, and there is the possibility that this sort of fractures the MAGA coalition on some level. I was always tremendously skeptical of the Trump is the dove kind of argument, during the campaign, especially because he was saber rattling, at the same time against Iran, but certainly there was a contingent of the America First folks that are pretty upset about this. So, the politics of this are interesting. On the other hand, to sort of tie this back, it is substantially more popular with Republicans, and, very few of them are in competitive districts. So if we're thinking about, I think one of the challenges when we talk about popularity and policy is that, when it comes to Congress, we're talking about national popularity, but within districts, it's potentially different. And so I think, things would have to go much more clearly badly before you start to see, I think, a critical mass of Republicans really pressured to push back a little bit. I mean, there's also the fact that this is, regime change has been a Republican goal in Iran for, 50 years at this point, or close to it. So walking away from that, I think is a bit of a challenge. And I think, sort of to that sort of constitutional point, this is at some level, I think Congress, the majority tacitly approves of this. There's not really a pushback. I think they are maybe less concerned about, constitutional issues and issues of power than they are about policy. And so, if they are getting roughly policy that they want, I think there's less incentive there to push back on the kind of intrusions of power, which is it's kind of an abandonment of the Federalist 51 argument, in its way that, the expectation is that he doesn't talk policy at all there, when Madison's talking about that, but that, each branch is going to be jealous of protecting its own power. And, here you have a scenario where Congress has pretty much abdicated that, but they're happy to abdicate because it is a policy goal that they're broadly on board with, which I feel like is a lot of the last 13, 14 months, however long the second Trump administration has been running now, that, they're perfectly happy to roll over so long as they're getting what they want. And, I think that is maybe, just roll with me here. I'm improvising at this point, but this is something that is maybe a problem baked into the system from the beginning. If we're thinking about sort of the kind of separation of powers kinds of arguments, that they really don't take into account partisanship or take into account, policy preferences. But I think that's why this is so hard to walk back.
I'm going to push back I'm back on that a little bit, because I think
Go for it.
Pete Hegseth can say all he wants about how we have plenty of munitions. We've destroyed their entire military practically, and we're winning. We've won this war basically right there. But
we've won it 14 times now, I think.
But yeah, but the fact on the big fact on the ground is that when you're driving around and you look at that corner gas station and you see that big $4.39 or $5 or whatever,
I bought $5 gas in Chicago.
Exactly. And so, sure, maybe some of these, maybe Trumpish Republicans will say, you know what? Yeah, we care about regime change in Iran, but we care a hell of a lot more that, gas has gone up 47% in 2 months. Diesel even more. And that's, maybe the less talked about part of this, but that's a huge part of this as well, given how much of our transportation infrastructure relies on this. And so I think at some point, if this doesn't get resolved, that the pressure will build, because I don't think the American people are going to stand for, average gas prices of $5-6 a gallon if it gets to that point. I mean, God, I hope it doesn't, right? But, and again, before the war, there were still stockpiles of some of these things those are really dwindled down to almost nothing, and not just gas, but fertilizer and other things. So we're going to see some serious knock-on effects. And here you have a president, a lame duck president who doesn't have to face the voters. And eventually, I think a lot of congressional Republicans, and we're starting to see a little bit, are saying, hey, wait a second, his interests and ours are really kind of diverging in a really significant way. He's going to be gone in a few years, but I want to still be here. And how do I navigate that? And I think time actually favors the Iranians here on this, because they're fighting for survival. They're a dictatorship. They don't have to worry about any kind of public opinion, not to the extent we do. And so I say if anyone's winning, Iran's winning at this point.
And
I would push that even a little further, because I think one of the reasons we get the situation in Iran that we end up with is partly because of the situation in Venezuela. Trump, that was awesome, right? That was so cool. We went in and took them over, and now we have a more cooperative regime in place. Maybe we could just take that model and put it, without thinking, like the Iranian regime is very different. It's religious in terms of its orientation. Winning here may be resisting being co-opted by the U.S. to give in on something. Trump wins in negotiations often because he can come to you and say, I'll take it way lower than you are willing to go, and I will, because I don't care. Well, you're dealing with a regime there where resistance to the U.S. is itself a win. The regime I'm not an expert in Middle Eastern politics, so I hope y'all push back on this because I'm almost certainly wrong about it. But it seems like it looked like the regime was very fragile and vulnerable before the war. Looks like, one, we're not sure who's in power, but displacing and the idea that we were going to have change seems harder now than it was before. And that may be overstated, and so I'll plead guilty to that. But it certainly, in some ways, it created a backlash, I think, against U.S. interest rather than supporting U.S. interest in the area. And then to the other point, because it's prolonged, because it has economic consequences, because it started off unpopular, this just seems a disaster for the Republican Party in the long run, unless they can find a way to declare victory and get out. And, and we continue to make this mistake of thinking that there's a Middle Eastern democracy out there that we can create if we just topple the leadership. And so far that hasn't worked out really well for us.
Yeah, I agree with you on all of that, and I had made kind of a similar point last week, and honestly at the beginning that, the concern here, you had a bit of pushback against the regime, there were protests, and, I don't think it clearly had not yet reached critical mass to the point where they're going to bring it down. But, my concern all along with this has been that, if you push at them, you're going to sort of, raise a patriotic spirit where, the Iranians, kind of consolidate around that regime. But yeah, I think, more broadly here, I think part of the problem is just that this whole thing has been so strategically poorly defined from the beginning that it's really unclear what victory looks like at this point. But I agree with Mike that, the Iranians, time is on their side. And I think this is often the case with, kind of bigger powers against smaller powers, fighting on their home turf. You don't have to win militarily. You just have to outlast. And that's kind of the Vietnam story. That's the American Revolution on some level. It's not that we were necessarily racking up decisive victories. It's just that at some point for the bigger power, this stops being fun anymore. And, it's problematic, in that way. So I would tend to agree that time is on their side. And I would say Mike, I agree with you. It's just earlier where you were pushing back a little. I don't think that there's not a breaking point for Republicans, in terms of unpopularity. I just think that it would take a lot more than just kind of stalemate, I think, to get there. $7 diesel might do it.
I think for Democrats politically, they would want this to drag out for 3, 4, 5 more months, right? Because if politically that works out well for them, though of course it hurts everyone else.
I think that's why they've been so publicly pushing the sort of taco thing with Trump is they kind of want him to recommit, on some level, kind of casting any sort of capitulation or any of that cut and run and declare victory, that's just Trump chickening out. And I've wondered that if on some level, the goal there is not to kind of keep him committed, so he doesn't look like a chicken, because politically, I think long-term, this is not good for Republicans in a lot of ways.
I guess in trying to read Trump on this, it's always a dangerous thing to try to do. But one level, I can see it's weird for me to say principled argument and Donald Trump in the same sentence, but I'll do it. Now, there's a principled argument that Trump at least appears to be making, and he said a number of times that, listen, I know prices are going to be higher, but it's worth it to get to ensure that that Iran is not a nuclear power. And that's not an unreasonable argument. And if anyone but Donald Trump were making it, and maybe this is I don't think I have TDS, but maybe I do on this. I don't know. But he lies so much that I have a hard time taking anything he says at face value. So maybe it's more that, the president who cried wolf, I suppose. But that's a reasonable point. But then I think, does he just not care has he written off the midterms at this point? And does he not care about the investigation? Because a president that cared about this stuff would be acting, I feel like, in a very different way in a lot of ways. And maybe he just can't help himself. Maybe I'm once again overthinking Trump and he's just going with whatever his gut tells him at this moment in time because it's gotten him this far. And hell, he's been pretty successful, right? So I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
My psychological theory of Trump is just, pick the dumbest thing that you could do. And that's probably what he's going to do. But I think some of this, I truly don't think he comprehends kind of the political reality that he finds himself in. I really do think that he lives in kind of this information bubble where he is popular and handsome and has great hair and everybody loves him and whatnot. You know, I mean, he if you look at kind of so many of his communications, you know, it is all of this talking about, you know, how popular I am and everything against me is fake news and all of that. And, you know, I think some of that is defensive of his ego, but I think he really does buy this. Like, I'm not sure that he understands how much trouble the Republicans are in for the midterms. You know, I think some of it, he's not a team player either. I mean, at some level, I'm not sure that he totally cares, you know, what happens to a lot of those guys. If you lose, you're a loser, and that's the worst thing you can be. But I do think that he does not have a grasp on how tenuous his situation is, most likely.
So two quick takes. One of them sort of supporting what you were saying, Mike, in the sense that I don't see this as purely politically calculated. I think that and this particular decision seems like it would have been a bad decision if it was purely politically calculated in terms of approval ratings, in terms of midterms, in terms of the sort of strategic calculations that we normally think of. It may be politically calculated in the sense of, say whatever else you will about Trump, he has big ambitions in terms of how he sees himself, his historical importance, the consequence of the Trump administration. And so I think that might have tempted him into this more than he probably should have been tempted. But I do think in this case, it's hard not to escape the conclusion that he really thought this was a dangerous situation and he really needed to do something about it. But then the last part is the hubris of thinking, I'm the only one who can pull it off because look what I just did in Venezuela. And so I'll be able to go in and do this and push the Iranians and get the deal that Obama wasn't able to get. And this is one of my marks as a historically consequential president. And so now there is another quick parallel that I would make, and that is, you know, in Vietnam, a lot of times you hear in the histories of it and read in the histories about LBJ believed he was such a deal maker and that he even thought in Vietnam, if he could just get in, he could make a deal, he could make this thing go away. But that wasn't the situation, and it wasn't sort of the Senate deal making. I think the same sort of logic applies to Trump here in this situation, is that he believes that he could make a deal here, and he could walk away with a deal, and so he's playing this game of trying to force the Iranians into a deal by pushing them, but not understanding who he's dealing with. And not understanding that it's not the typical situation that he's used to. This is a different regime. This is a different group of people. They have different goals. They have different, and so he's trying to play his normal deal-making game in a situation where it just doesn't work.
And I mean, there have been, on that Trump looking to his legacy, there have recently been a number of media reports, and I'm sure, you know, Trump folks will say fake news, but him saying that, you know, he now considers himself a world historical figure, not just surpassing U.S. presidents, but up there with, you know, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, like top 2, 3, 4 in history, that sort of thing. I mean, you know, Washington, Lincoln, they were just nothing compared to me. But it kind of tracks, but then on the deal making thing, the thing is, it seems to me there's no deal here. What he's been saying, as far as I can tell, is the deal is Iran will unconditionally surrender, and that's the deal. And that's not a deal. I mean, I don't know what, but like to your point, Kirby, he doesn't seem to understand that he can't just roll over the Iranian regime like he rolled over Venezuela or like he rolls over congressional Republicans, because it's an entirely different animal, and he doesn't really appreciate that, I think.
Dan Dresner had a great piece either at the beginning of the first Trump administration or maybe right before, about how, you know, Trump and his view of deal making largely comes from New York real estate, and that was going to be a problem because foreign policy is not New York real estate. And I think that's maybe part of this as well. I mean, some of this is hubris, but, you know, to the extent that he was a deal maker, and from a lot of what I've seen, he tended to overpay for things. And you know, again, there's that grandiosity back there, you know, I'm going to pay a ton for the Plaza Hotel and put my name on it, you know, sort of thing. But I think that's sort of another component of this as a problem, is just that, you know, to the extent that he had past success making deals with people, you know, real estate is nothing like Iran. You know, I mean, it's just, I mean, I guess real estate in the sense that, you know, the Strait of Hormuz is a physical place, but the dynamics of this are radically different. And he just really seems kind of over his skis here. And, you know, I agree. I don't even know. I mean, they canceled sending the envoys. I mean, last week we'd been talking about, it's terrible that they're sending Jared and, to negotiate, and then they didn't even send that. But, he had said yesterday, well, they offered terms and those terms were unacceptable. But we never even see what any of these terms are. I mean, it's not clear what terms they're offering, what terms he's offering. And again, I mean, if you're negotiating on something, there's got to be some give and take. And I think you have kind of two sets of hardliners here that probably can't do that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that brings us to a close for today. And hey, if anything we talked about today made a particular impression, whether you loved it, completely disagreed, or maybe you have a question for us, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at mail@politicsguys.com or reach out through Facebook, X, or our supporters Discord. All the links are, as always, in the show notes, and I'm on our Discord all the time. And if you're getting value from the show and you want to support what we do, the best way is through Patreon. You can even start with a free trial. All supporters get ad-free episodes, the full midweek show instead of just a preview, and access to the Discord with even more benefits at higher levels of support. And if Patreon isn't your thing, we also have PayPal and Venmo with all those links in the show notes and at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like the full midweek show without that just short cutoff there at about 15 minutes or so, but you can't support us financially, totally not a problem. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com. I will be happy to get that set up for you. And whether you support us or not, it would be a big help if you could subscribe, rate, and review the show on wherever you listen, as well as sharing episodes. And finally, as always, a very special thanks to our executive producers. They're a fantastic group: Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugate. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,